I've never been much of a fan of camping, but that particular weekend, I ended up giving in. My name's Luke, I'm 27, and this happened about 2 years ago. Back then, I was trying to hang out more with my friends to relieve some work stress, so when John suggested a trip to State Park, I didn't think twice. The group was small. Besides me, there was John, Mary, Peter, and Kyle. We'd been friends since college, but with adult life kicking in, these little getaways were rare. We got to the park on a sunny Friday, set up our tents near a clearing, and spent the rest of the day hiking the trails and just chatting. The weather was perfect, and I, not being super experienced with camping, was starting to like the idea of spending the night surrounded by nature. When the sun started setting, we headed back to camp and lit a fire. Mary brought marshmallows, and John, as usual, was excited to tell some scary stories, something he'd always done since college. That's when we realized Kyle had wandered off. He said he was going to get more firewood, but it had been about 20 minutes, and he still hadn't come back. At first, no one really worried. He was always the adventurous type, the kind of guy who liked to explore and lose track of time. But when half an hour passed, Peter stood up, flashlight in hand, and said, "I'm gonna go check on him." Mary suggested we wait a little longer, but John agreed with Peter. I was starting to feel a little uneasy, but I trusted Kyle would be back soon. That's when we noticed how quiet it was getting. No crickets, no wind, just the crackling of the fire breaking the silence. After a few more minutes of waiting, we decided it didn't make sense to just sit there. I grabbed my flashlight, and along with Peter and John, we went off to look for Kyle. Mary stayed behind in case he came back on his own. We followed the path he'd probably taken, a short trail leading into a more wooded area. The park looked beautiful during the day, but at night, it felt like something straight out of a horror movie. The shadows from the trees made weird shapes, and the air felt heavier. We walked for about 5 minutes without saying a word, shining our flashlights on the ground and the trees around us, until Peter suddenly stopped. He pointed his flashlight at the ground and said, "Look at this." It was Kyle's flashlight, lying near a fallen log. When I picked it up, it still felt warm, like it had been used just a moment ago. That gave me the chills. It was as if he'd been right there seconds ago. We called his name several times, but there was no answer. "Kyle. If you're trying to scare us, it's not funny," John yelled, trying to sound angrier than he actually was. But the silence was overwhelming. I decided to look around more closely. I noticed that the spot where the flashlight had fallen seemed odd. The ground was a little sunken, like someone had stepped there repeatedly, but there were no clear footprints. We decided to push further into the woods, thinking maybe he had gotten lost or hurt. That's when we heard it for the first time. A distant scream, almost like a groan, cut through the air. "Help! I'm here!" It sounded like Kyle's voice, but there was something off about it, weak, uneven, like he was talking and crying at the same time. We looked at each other, hesitant. "Is that him?" I asked, but no one answered. We just kept moving, the beam from Peter's flashlight trembling slightly as it lit our way. We followed the sound of the voice, but it seemed like it was always moving, like Kyle was walking in circles or something. John started to get impatient. "This doesn't make sense, he can't be that far away," he said, his voice louder than necessary. Peter, always the calm one, suggested we stop and listen carefully before moving on. We stood in silence for a few seconds, and there it was again, "Help! Please, I'm here." This time, it sounded closer, but something was seriously wrong. It was like every word had a weird echo, a metallic tone that sent a chill down my spine. "I don't know, man, this is getting weird," I whispered, but John ignored me and kept moving toward the sound. Peter and I hesitated, but we eventually followed him. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing, that sounded like Kyle, but it wasn't him. As we moved forward, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew denser, the low branches scratched at our arms, and the ground was covered in damp leaves, making each step feel heavier. Suddenly, the voice stopped. The silence was so sudden it felt like even the wind had stopped. We stood there, frozen, looking at each other until Peter whispered, "I think we should go back." Before we could respond, we heard something new, footsteps, coming from behind us. We swung our flashlights around, lighting up the path we just walked, but there was nothing there. Just the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, getting closer and closer. My heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. Kyle? Is that you? John called, his voice trembling a little now. But whatever was there didn't answer. It just stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the footsteps. Then, out of nowhere, the voice came back. Please, don't leave me here. This time, it came from a completely different direction, like Kyle was moving really fast, faster than any of us could run through that thick forest. John started walking quickly in the direction of the sound, but Peter grabbed his arm. Wait. This isn't right. How can he be moving like that? And why hasn't he shown up? We need to think. I nodded, still holding my flashlight tight. My heart was beating so loud it felt like it was echoing in my head. That's when we saw it, a few yards away, a faint light in the middle of the trees, flickering slowly. Is that his flashlight? I asked, my voice low, trying not to sound terrified. Without waiting for an answer, John moved toward it. Peter and I followed, though every step felt heavier than the last. When we reached the light, we realized it wasn't Kyle's flashlight. It was something smaller, glowing like a firefly, but it made a faint crackling sound, like it was burning the air around it. We stood there, frozen, staring at it, not understanding what we were seeing. What the hell is that? John muttered, but no one had an answer. Then we heard the loudest scream yet, a scream that sounded like Kyle, but it was so distorted and high-pitched it physically hurt my ears. The light flickered violently, and in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Peter grabbed my shoulder and said, "Enough. Let's go back now and get help." John hesitated, but before he could respond, we heard heavy footsteps coming from all directions at once. They didn't sound human anymore, they were fast, disjointed, and the noise that came with them was something between a growl and a laugh. The moment the footsteps started to surround us, it was like all the courage we had left vanished. "Run!" Peter shouted, grabbing my arm. Without thinking twice, we sprinted back toward the camp. Every step felt like it was taking us further away, like the forest was throwing us in circles. The flashlights were shaking in our hands, lighting up only disconnected bits of trunks and leaves. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every now and then, I was sure I saw something in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving too fast, or eyes glowing between the branches. John was ahead, but he suddenly stopped, and we almost ran into him. "What's wrong?" I gasped. He just pointed. About 20 yards away, lit by the weak light of his flashlight, there was a figure standing. Tall, skinny, with a crooked posture, but the clothes looked like Kyle's. "Kyle?" John called, his voice now a thread of hope and terror. The figure didn't respond, but it started moving slowly toward us, stumbling like it was hurt. With each step, the flashlight revealed more details. The face looked wrong. The skin was way too pale, the eyes hollow, but the worst part was the mouth. A wide, fixed smile, like it had been forced into place. Peter took a step back. "That's not him," he whispered. But John, maybe driven by desperation, started walking toward the figure. "Kyle. Is that you? What happened?" I tried to grab him, but he pushed me away. That's when the thing that looked like Kyle stopped and tilted its head in an unnatural way, as if it was watching us. Then, it opened its mouth and screamed, a sound so loud and distorted, it felt like it was coming from all directions in the forest. John froze in place, and I swear, at that moment, I thought we were all going to die. That scream was enough to snap me out of the trance. Grabbing Peter's arm, I started pulling him in the opposite direction, shouting for John to follow. He seemed frozen, his eyes locked on the figure, which was now just a few steps away from him. "John! Move, man!" I yelled, my voice almost getting swallowed up by the echo of that distorted sound still ringing through the woods. Finally, he moved, stumbling backward and running after us. I didn't look back, I didn't want to see if it was following us. The forest felt endless, but then, almost like a miracle, we saw the faint light of the campfire. Mary was there, standing, holding a piece of wood like it was a weapon. "What happened?" "Where's Kyle?" she shouted, but none of us could answer. We all just collapsed around the fire, trying to catch our breath and make sense of what we had just witnessed. As we tried to explain what happened, we heard that voice again. "Help! I'm here." This time, it sounded like it was really close, like it was right behind the trees surrounding the camp. Mary started crying, and Peter held the flashlight tight, pointing it toward the darkness. "That's not him," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. If it was Kyle, he would have shown up by now. It was hard to convince the others, but we agreed we needed to leave and get help. We abandoned the tents and made our way to the car, always looking back, expecting to see that figure again. But the walk to the parking lot felt strange. It seemed too short, like we had just stepped out of a nightmare and straight into reality. When we got there, we called the police and told them everything, but we never found Kyle. Just his flashlight, and to this day, when I think about that sound and that smile, I wonder what we really encountered in that forest.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
My husband Daniel and I moved into a new apartment about 2 months ago. We were excited about finally having our own place, even though it was a small one in an old building. The rent was insanely cheap, which should have been a red flag, but at the time it felt like a lucky find. The building had that nostalgic charm, with ornate iron railings and one of those old elevators with manual doors that you have to pull yourself. Despite that, it had its quirks. The building manager warned us that the 5th floor had been off limits for repairs for years. He said the owners had been putting off the renovations, so no one was allowed up there. The first few weeks were smooth, but soon we started noticing something odd. The elevator, which was supposed to skip the 5th floor, would occasionally stop there, even if no one had pressed the button. At first, I thought it was just a technical glitch. I even joked with Daniel that the building had personality. He, always the practical one, said it was probably an electrical issue and that we should report it to the building manager. I didn't think much of it, especially since I never had the nerve to open the elevator door when it stopped on the 5th floor. Something about that floor made me uneasy. Maybe the darkness seeping through the cracks in the door, or the absolute silence that seemed to swallow up the air. That night in particular, I was in the living room, finishing up some unpacking, while Daniel went down to the lobby to pick up a package. He left with his usual lazy grin, saying he'd be back in 2 minutes. Time passed, and I started feeling uneasy. 10 minutes, then 15. I tried to convince myself that he probably stopped to chat with someone. He was always that way, finding any excuse to make small talk. But when 30 minutes went by and I hadn't heard from him, the anxiety started creeping in. I called him. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before it went to voicemail. I ran downstairs to the lobby, my heart racing faster with every step. The doorman gave me a confused look when I asked if he had seen Daniel. "He took the elevator a while ago, ma'am," was all he said. That strange chill ran down my spine. I decided to take the elevator and check every floor. As it started going up, my mind was racing faster than ever. When the panel lit up with the number 5, a knot formed in my stomach. The elevator doors opened, revealing the rusty iron gate that led into the dark, dusty hallway. I was about to close the door quickly, but something caught my eye. Daniel's phone was lying on the floor, right in the middle of the doorway. I didn't know what to do. I froze, staring at his phone, lit up by the faint glow from the elevator. My mind was running wild. How did his phone end up there? There was no way Daniel could have gotten through the locked gate. Even though fear was suffocating me, I opened the gate and stepped out cautiously. I picked up his phone, feeling the weight of it in my hand, like an anchor pulling me back to reality. The screen was cracked, but still on, showing the last message I had sent him. "Is everything okay?" My stomach turned when I realized there was an unsent reply from him. "I'm getting off at the 5th of..." The text ended abruptly. I looked around. The hallway was suffocating, with peeling walls and a musty smell, like something old and abandoned. The apartment doors were all boarded up, some covered in so much dust it looked like gray snow. The silence there was almost palpable. as if the air itself was stuck in time. The floor door, which should have been locked, remained shut, but it seemed to pulse, as if someone, or something, was on the other side. I couldn't move for a moment, the fear turning my legs to stone. It wasn't until I heard a distant sound, almost like a muffled groan coming from somewhere beyond the door, that I realized I needed to get out of there immediately. I ran back to the elevator, pressing the button to my floor over and over, as if that would speed up the process. The doors closed with a metallic creak, and the elevator began to rise. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped Daniel's phone. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing off the elevator walls. When I finally reached our floor, I hurried out and locked the apartment door as soon as I stepped inside. I tried calling the police, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen of Daniel's phone, still in my hand, went black and wouldn't turn on, as if it had drained completely. I felt helpless, completely isolated in that building. I decided I had to figure out what was happening. I turned on my laptop and started searching for information about the building. It didn't take long to find a shady forum where former tenants shared disturbing experiences. Some mentioned the 5th floor, describing sounds of footsteps, doors slamming, and, most unsettling of all, people disappearing after the elevator stopped there. One comment in particular caught my attention. The 5th floor isn't empty. They just don't want us to know who or what is still living there. My blood ran cold. While I was reading, I heard a noise from the hallway outside the apartment, like something heavy being dragged. My instinct screamed at me not to open the door, but the fear of what might be happening to Daniel pushed me forward. With as much caution as I could muster, I unlocked the door and peeked through the crack. The hallway seemed empty, but the sound still echoed, as if something was moving slowly, out of sight. I gathered my courage and stepped out, holding an old flashlight we kept for emergencies. I followed the sound until I realized it was coming from the elevator. The doors were open, but the elevator wasn't there, just the dark, deep shaft, swallowing up the light from my flashlight. That's when I noticed something caught on the steel cable, a piece of fabric, clearly from the shirt Daniel was wearing. My heart raced, and a terror I had never felt before took over me. Still, something made me look closer. I leaned over the shaft, shining the light down, and almost screamed when I saw the reflection of something shiny deeper down. It didn't look like metal. It looked like eyes. 2 glowing spots, like those of an animal, staring at me in a way that froze my body. Suddenly, I felt a cold wind rise from the shaft, along with a horrible smell of rotting flesh. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw a shapeless figure down below. Tall, hunched, with arms far too long to be human. I couldn't wait any longer. I ran back to the apartment, slammed the door, and pushed all the furniture I could to block the entrance. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting on the living room floor, with the flashlight beside me and Daniel's phone now completely dead. The building was immersed in an oppressive silence, and every little noise made my heart jump. At 6 a.m, when I finally heard the sounds of the city coming back to life, I decided to leave the apartment. I needed answers, or at least someone who would believe me. I went straight to the building manager, who seemed to be waiting for me. Before I could say anything, he looked at me with a heavy expression and said, "I told you to stay away from the 5th floor." Then he told me something that made my world crumble. Decades ago, the building had been a sanatorium, and the 5th floor was where they kept the patients considered dangerous. After a series of violent incidents, the floor was sealed off, and the authorities declared the building unfit for use. Years later, it was renovated and converted into apartments, but no one had been able to keep tenants for long. The manager said that occasionally, strange things would happen. "Sometimes, the elevator seems to remember the old days," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the floor. When I mentioned Daniel, he just shook his head. "If he went to the 5th floor, I'm sorry, miss, no one comes back from there." I refused to accept what the manager said, I couldn't just give up on Daniel. I spent the entire day trying to find more information about the building, digging through old records, news articles, and anything that could give me a clue. I found out that the sanatorium had been shut down in a hurry after a series of inexplicable disappearances. Reports from staff mentioned patients who couldn't be identified in the records, and sounds coming from the 5th floor, even when it was empty. One news story in particular stuck with me: the disappearance of a doctor who was last seen entering the elevator. When I returned to the apartment that night, I was exhausted and on the verge of a breakdown. I sat on the couch, holding Daniel's phone, as if it could give me some comfort. That's when the screen, which had been dead until then, suddenly lit up by itself. A message appeared. "I'm here. Don't give up." It was from him. The mix of fear and hope almost left me breathless. I ran to the elevator with the flashlight, determined to face whatever I had to find him. I pressed the button for the 5th floor, and the elevator began to rise slowly, creaking as if resisting my desire to reach it. When the doors opened on the 5th floor, a wave of cold air engulfed me, almost making me step back. The flashlight only illuminated the hallway ahead, but everything seemed different from before. The walls, which had been peeling and dusty, now had deep marks, like scratches that ran the entire length. The silence was absolute, except for a distant sound, like dragging footsteps. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to move forward. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I called out for Daniel. My voice echoed, but no response came. As I walked, I noticed that the boarded-up doors seemed to be slightly open, as if something had forced its way through. As I passed one of them, I felt a presence behind me. It wasn't a sound or a clear vision. It was as if the air had become heavier. I looked over my shoulder and saw a long, disproportionate shadow that wasn't mine. Before I could react, I felt something cold as ice touch my arm, and I quickly turned the flashlight behind me. There was nothing there, but the hallway seemed darker, as if the light itself was being consumed. I moved forward, trying to ignore the feeling that something was watching me. At the end of the hallway, I noticed a door that hadn't been there before, at least not during my first visit. It was different from the others: heavy metal, with rust marks and a strange symbol carved into the center, something that looked like a mix of a spiral and an eye. The presence there felt even stronger, as if the air around the door was alive. Without thinking too much, I twisted the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, almost empty room, lit only by the weak light from my flashlight. And that's when I saw him. Daniel was standing in the middle of the room, his back to me, completely still. My heart almost leapt out of my chest, but my joy was quickly replaced by deep fear. Something was wrong. The way he was standing, with his shoulders stiff and his head tilted unnaturally, made me hesitate. "Daniel?" I called, my voice weak. He turned slowly, and that's when I realized it wasn't the Daniel I knew anymore. His face was pale, his eyes completely black, devoid of any life. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound that came out was a multiple whisper, as if dozens of voices were speaking at once. "You shouldn't be here." My body froze. It was as if those words had weight, pinning my feet to the floor. Daniel, or whatever that was, took a step toward me. His movement was odd, like he had no full control over his own body. I felt my instincts scream at me to run, but I couldn't move. He extended his hand toward me, and in that instant, I realized I couldn't let it touch me. With all the strength I had left, I took a step back and raised the flashlight, pointing it directly at his face. The light seemed to burn him, and he recoiled, letting out a high-pitched sound that made my ears throb. I took the opening to run back into the hallway, my heart pounding and my breath shallow. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps, as if he were following me. The hallway seemed endless, every door identical to the last. When I finally reached the elevator, I frantically pressed the button, praying it would get there in time. The footsteps grew closer, and then I felt a cold wind behind me. The elevator doors opened with a metallic sound, and I threw myself inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, I saw one last image. Daniel standing in the hallway, his head tilted at an impossible angle, staring directly at me with that emptiness in his eyes. When the elevator finally reached the ground floor, I stumbled out, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The doorman looked at me, startled, but I couldn't say anything. I ran out into the street, feeling the cold night air fill my lungs. It wasn't until I was far enough from the building that I realized I was still holding Daniel's phone. The screen was on again, but now it showed something different. A photo. It was of the 5th floor, taken from the same hallway I had just run through. In the picture, Daniel was in the back, standing in the same disturbing position I had seen, but now there were other figures around him. Curved shadows, glowing eyes, and mouths open in silent whispers. I spent the night at a nearby hotel, unable to go back to the apartment. The next day, I returned to the building with the police, trying to explain what had happened. When we reached the 5th floor, it was completely different. All the doors were sealed again, and the hallway seemed untouched, covered in the same thick dust as before. There was no sign of Daniel, or whatever it was that I had seen. The officers looked at me as if I were crazy, but the doorman, with a heavy look, just shook his head and whispered, "I told you." I left that building the same day, leaving everything behind. I never managed to find Daniel again, and to this day, I wonder if he's still there, trapped in that place that doesn't belong to this world. Sometimes my phone vibrates for no reason, and when I check, there are messages with no sender that say things like, "Come back." I never reply. But the truth is, part of me wants to believe that he can still be saved. Another part, though, knows that what I saw that night was no longer my husband. It was something much worse.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I'm Anna, a nurse with over 10 years of experience, and right now I work the night shift at a small-town hospital. It's January 2025, and the night shifts have been especially lonely ever since the pandemic started to wind down. Back then, I was trying to juggle my exhausting job with taking care of my elderly parents, all while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in the midst of a chaos that seemed never-ending. That particular night, I was finishing my shift around 2 a.m. The hospital was quiet, with only the occasional beeping of monitors and the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. I was heading to the break room when I noticed a room at the end of the hall, strangely lit up. Curiosity getting the best of me, and feeling a bit worn out, I decided to check it out. When I walked in, I found an elderly man sitting on the bed, staring at me with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of untold stories. What really struck me, though, was that he didn't have any ID or medical file visible, which was completely out of the ordinary. A chill ran down my spine as I watched him. His presence there made no sense, especially considering that, according to the hospital's records, that room had been empty for weeks. I tried to ask him something, but he just shook his head slowly, as if waiting for me to understand without words. I decided to leave, but when I turned around, he was gone, as if he had never been there. My heart started racing, and a deep sense of unease settled over me. The next morning, I told a coworker about what happened, hoping he could explain it. To my surprise, he had no idea what I was talking about. I asked around with other team members, but no one had any record of an extra patient or anything about that room. I started doubting my own memory, but the image of that man stayed clear in my mind. I decided I needed to figure out what was going on, even if it meant confronting something I couldn't explain. So I decided to go through the hospital records on my own, something I'd never done before. I spent hours combing through old files and digital systems, but I couldn't find a single mention of that mysterious man. Frustration started to build, but a part of me was determined not to let it slide. That night, while trying to sleep with my mind racing, I heard soft footsteps in the hall. My heart skipped a beat as I realized someone was approaching the room where I had seen the man. Slowly, I made my way to the door, gripping my flashlight tightly. But when I opened it, the room was empty again, and the air felt heavier, like it was filled with untold secrets. In the days that followed, it kept happening. Every night that man would return, always in the same room, always with no record of him anywhere. I started to feel like something supernatural was going on, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the stress building up, or the loneliness of long shifts. But there was always something different each time. Sometimes he would mutter words that sounded like ancient prayers. Other times his hands would move as if he was desperately trying to communicate something important. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, and the hospital itself seemed to change, taking on an air of mystery and unease that lingered even during the day. As the days went by, my determination only grew. I decided I needed to be there every time he appeared, so I started extending my shifts, staying at the hospital even when there was nothing to do. Each night, I sat near the hallway where his room was, watching every movement. It was exhausting, but the need for answers consumed me. There was something deeply unsettling about his presence, an energy that made the air vibrate and my heart race. I started writing down every detail, the exact time of his appearances, his posture, even the expression on his aged face that seemed to hide unfathomable secrets. One of the coldest nights in December, everything changed. While watching, I noticed the light in his room flickering irregularly, like someone was struggling to keep it on. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, coming from inside the room. My body froze, and a wave of terror washed over me. I decided to go in, my flashlight shaking in my hands. The door was ajar, and the temperature seemed to have dropped drastically. As I crossed the threshold, the man was there again, but this time he was standing, staring directly at me with a look that seemed to pierce my soul. He slowly raised his hand, pointing to something I couldn't see, and then vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving only the echo of his unsettling whisper behind. The next morning, I could barely sleep. The whisper I had heard the night before seemed to echo in my mind, bringing with it a sense of urgency I couldn't ignore. I decided to go back to the room the following day, determined to figure out what that man wanted. When darkness fell over the hospital, I felt a mix of fear and determination as I walked down the quiet hallway. Each step I took seemed to amplify the silence around me, and the light from my flashlight flickered slightly in my hand. When I reached the door to his room, I took a deep breath and slowly pushed the door open, hoping once again to find the mysterious man. This time, he wasn't alone. As I entered, I noticed that the room was filled with a dense fog that seemed to glow faintly and ghostly. The man was sitting at the edge of the bed, but this time he held an object in his hands, an old yellowed photograph. His eyes, full of sadness, were fixed on the image as though he were trying to convey a silent message to me. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of the scene. The fog began to shift, taking on indistinct shapes that danced around the room, and I felt an even stronger, more unsettling presence. I knew I was on the brink of something much bigger than I could imagine, but the need to unravel this mystery drove me to keep going. That night, I could hardly contain my anxiety as I studied the photograph he held. The image showed a smiling family, dressed in clothing that looked like it was from the 60s, all gathered in front of a house that, strangely, looked identical to the hospital building. My heart skipped a beat when I realized that the house in the photo was located on the same street where I had grown up, though I had never heard of that particular family. I decided I needed to find out more about them, believing that perhaps the man was trying to tell me a story forgotten by time. With the photograph in hand, I started digging into the town's old records, going through public archives and talking to older residents. Every clue I found seemed to bring me closer to a secret buried decades ago. I learned that many years back, a family had mysteriously disappeared in that specific house, and the case was never solved. The deeper I dug, the more I felt the presence of that man watching me, as if he were guiding me toward the truth. The sense that something supernatural was at play grew stronger and more real, and I knew I was about to uncover a mystery that had been hidden for so long. I decided to visit the old house shown in the photograph, now an abandoned building surrounded by tall weeds. The street where I grew up had changed a lot over the years, but the house's structure was still recognizable, with broken windows and the front door hanging by its hinges. As I walked through the overgrown yard, a feeling of nostalgia mixed with unease took over me. I touched the door slowly, hoping to hear something, but all I got was the creaking of the wind through the cracks. I stepped inside, the only light coming from the faint glow of my flashlight, and began exploring the quiet rooms, looking for any trace that could link the missing family to the mystery I had been experiencing at the hospital. Upstairs, I found a room that seemed untouched by time. A 4-poster bed covered in a dusty sheet, old toys scattered across the floor, and in the center, a wooden box, locked. My heart raced as I approached, feeling like I was about to discover something crucial. I struggled to open the box, which creaked open with a snap, revealing a stack of yellowed letters and another photograph of the family, this time with a handwritten message. We never forgot. As I held that letter, a wave of memories and inexplicable emotions washed over me, as if the presence of that man had finally led me to uncover the long-hidden truth. I realized that the connection between the past and the present was deeper than I had imagined, and that my journey was far from over. With the letters and the new photograph in hand, I felt like I was getting closer to the truth. I decided to return to the hospital with all the evidence I had gathered, hoping that some connection would reveal itself. That night, as I walked through the silent hallways, a feeling of déjà vu washed over me, as if I were returning to the beginning of it all. When I reached the mysterious room, the man appeared again, but this time there was something different in his eyes, a mix of relief and gratitude. He pointed to the letters I was holding, and I understood that I needed to read the messages to uncover what tied them together. Sitting beside him, I began to read the letters aloud. Each one revealed details about the missing family and the events that led to their disappearance, including a dark secret that connected them to the hospital. As the words came to life, the fog around us started to dissipate, and the atmosphere in the room changed completely. The man smiled gently, and a sense of peace filled me. Suddenly, he vanished, leaving behind only the feeling that the story had finally been told. I felt one last wave of gratitude and relief, knowing that, in some way, I had helped solve a mystery that had haunted that place for so long.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.